Me and my older brother Cameron were on a camping trip on the East Coast. Cameron chose the sites and planned everything like he usually did, and I just tagged along. He chose well, though. The campsite was really nice, and since we had to hike to get there, it wasn't crowded. From what we could see, there was nobody else around. The campsite wasn't very well defined, and it was hard to tell if we were even in the right spot. There were several openings in the trees that looked like they could be the designated area, but neither of us thought it mattered. We set up on one of the grassy clearings, and while we initially thought this place wasn't very active, we quickly realized we were wrong. There were leftover things scattered around, not entire tents or anything big, just small items like a trekking pole or an old pair of shoes. It wasn't normal for things like that to be left behind, especially not at a remote campsite like this. We both thought it was weird, but we went on with our day, just hanging out and talking. As night fell, we lit a fire and sat around it. A couple of hours in, I happened to spot something behind Cameron. I pointed it out, unsure of what it was. Both of us looked, and after a few moments, we could make out a small campfire in the distance. It was really far away and partially obscured by trees, but the tiny orange flame flickered in the darkness. If it hadn't been for the clouds covering the moonlight and the absolute blackness of the woods, we probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. I guess we weren't alone. Still, it was strange. There didn't seem to be any clearings or good spots for a campsite over there, just dense forest. Maybe they wanted to be away from people or something. We didn't think too much about it. Instead, we grabbed some snacks and drinks and talked until we were exhausted. We put out our fire and went to bed around midnight. I fell asleep easily, but at some point in the night, I woke up. It must have only been an hour or two after I'd gone to sleep, and I knew exactly why I had woken up. I had drunk too much before bed and needed to relieve myself. I got up, unzipped the tent, and walked about 50 feet from our campsite to avoid attracting any animals. As I stood there, I noticed that the distant flame in the woods was still burning. Maybe because I was tired or just out of it, I found myself staring at it for a minute. My eyes gradually adjusted to the dark, and as I looked out into the woods, I suddenly noticed something else. A figure. It was somewhere far between me and the distant campfire. A cold shock ran through me, but I tried to tell myself it was just a weirdly shaped bush or something. There was no way someone was just standing out there in the darkness outside our camp at this hour. But as I kept looking, trying to make sense of it, I started to notice more of these figures, shadowy shapes scattered throughout the woods. They were so far away, and it was so dark that I couldn't tell if my mind was playing tricks on me. But if they were people, there had to be at least 10 or 15 of them, and they all seemed to be facing me. Another shock ran through me. What the hell is this? I almost thought I was hallucinating. I turned around and hurried back to the tent, debating whether to wake Cameron up. If it was nothing, he'd never let me live it down. But my gut told me otherwise. I unzipped his tent and shook him awake. He was confused at first, but I quickly told him I thought I saw something and wanted him to check. Hesitantly, he got up, and I led him to where I had been standing. But we didn't have to go far. The figures had moved. They were closer now, spread out among the trees. My stomach dropped. I turned to look at Cameron, and I could see the pale, horrified expression on his face. His eyes were wide with fear. He saw what I saw. I looked back at the figures, and now, more than ever, it was clear these were people. I could see their subtle movements as they stood there, watching us. We backed up toward our tents. Should we leave? Cameron's voice was shaky. He was always so confident, so sure of what to do. Hearing him like that was terrifying. I nodded. We didn't grab any of our stuff, except for the car keys and our wallets. Then we took off, hurrying down the trail. They didn't follow us. When we got back, we reported what happened to the police. We felt like we had to, but they didn't take it too seriously, clearly thinking we were just seeing things. Like there was no way a whole group of people was out in the woods at night, watching us. We thought about all the strange, abandoned items we had seen at the campsite. Had others seen these people too? Had anyone else reported something like this? But there were no official records of anything strange happening there. Maybe the encounters just went unreported, or maybe no one ever made it back to report them. It was 2 years ago, in the middle of spring, when I took some time off work to go camping at a small lake in northern Minnesota. I had been there a couple of times before with friends or family, but this time I was alone. The hike to the lake took about 2 hours, but it wasn't too difficult, mostly just a flat trail all the way. After arriving, I set up my tent a little way into the woods, away from the lake, to avoid being right on the water's edge. Once everything was settled, I unfolded my chair, popped open a beer, and listened to the calming sounds of the water and the birds. It was already late in the day, so I didn't have much time before the sun started to set. Nighttime in the woods had always felt peaceful to me, quiet and almost freeing in a way. I don't know how else to describe it, but that night was different. Once the sun went down, I built up a campfire and continued relaxing. Yet, this strange feeling crept over me, one I wasn't used to. I felt like I was being watched. My eyes kept scanning the darkness surrounding me, looking at the trees, searching for anything out of place. I was never the paranoid type, so I wasn't sure why I felt this way. But every time I looked around, I saw nothing. Of course, it was so dark that even if something, or someone, was out there, I might not have been able to see them. I had no real reason to feel this way, so I did my best to suppress the thoughts and shake it off. Eventually, I distracted myself by thinking about some personal matters. Not the most pleasant distraction, but at least it kept my mind from spiraling into paranoia. Hours passed. I think it was around 10 or 11 p.m. when I suddenly heard a loud, sharp crack in front of me, like a large stick snapping under heavy weight. It came from somewhere just ahead, deep in the darkness. The sound was so loud that it echoed through the woods. A shiver ran through me. It sounded like something heavy had stepped on a branch. Was it a large animal or a person? I wasn't sure which possibility scared me more. I quickly grabbed my bear spray and called out, "Hello? Someone there?" Silence. Not a single sound answered me. I couldn't shake the feeling that if it had been an animal, I would have heard more movement, leaves crunching, bushes rustling. But there was nothing. Just an eerie, unnatural stillness. I sat there for a long moment, staring into the darkness, waiting, listening. Then, I remembered my flashlight. Digging through my backpack, I pulled it out and flicked it on. Nothing. The woods were empty. At least, that's what I thought. Paranoia started creeping back in, but this time, it felt justified. I quickly added more wood to the fire, ensuring it burned bright enough to illuminate my campsite. Every few minutes, I turned my flashlight back on and scanned the area. Then, one time, I saw it. At the very edge of the light's reach, there was a person, a man. He was freakishly tall, not inhumanly so, but easily 6 feet 5 inches, maybe taller. The moment my light hit him, he moved, quickly retreating into the darkness beyond my flashlight's beam. My adrenaline surged. Had my gut feeling been right all along? I thought back to the sound I'd heard earlier, that loud snap, the weight behind it. It had to have been him. And if he had been there all this time, that meant he had been watching me for who knows how long. I panicked. I tore down my tent as fast as I could, stuffing my belongings into my backpack with shaking hands. I knew which direction he had run, so I bolted in the opposite direction, back toward my car. I ran for a while before slowing down to a fast walk, feeling just safe enough to turn my flashlight to its dim setting. As I walked, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Why had he been out there? If he wanted to rob me or attack me, why didn't he do it immediately? Why just watch? The only thing I could think of was that he might have been trying to see if I was armed. Or maybe he had been waiting for me to fall asleep. I finally reached my car, threw my gear inside, and drove home. I still go camping, but it's never been the same since that night. Now, no matter where I am, I always feel like I'm being watched. I just hope it's only a feeling. This happened a while ago, I want to say around 2014. I live in a pretty woodsy town with lots of forest around it and plenty of small campgrounds within an hour or so. I had a 4-day weekend off from work and hadn't gotten out in a while, so I decided to head to one of these campgrounds for a laid-back weekend camping trip. The campground I chose was a small one where you park in a dirt lot and choose one of the 3 sites available to set up your tent. There were already fire pits and even some grills and benches. They looked awful, but I guess some people still use them. All 3 spots were open and no other cars were there, so I just chose the one on the far left and put all my things over there. The walk from my truck to the campsite was only about 5 minutes, but the area was so densely covered in trees that it still felt like I was deep in the woods. Plus, the actual campground was about 45 minutes from town. It was about an hour in when I realized I had no idea what to do. Should I just sit here and relax, read a book? I wasn't sure. I thought maybe there was a trail nearby, so I walked back toward the entrance to check. There wasn't. But now there was another car parked next to mine. It was an old, rusted red Toyota, covered in dents and scratches, and what really stood out was that it had no license plate, front or back. I didn't know what to think, but I figured whoever owned it must have been camping at one of the other spots. Since there was no trail, I just headed back to my campsite and sat on a log. About 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw a man walking down the trail. He didn't have a backpack or anything, and he was looking right at me, like he was coming specifically to talk to me. He looked to be in his 30s, but his rough appearance made him seem older. His brown jacket had holes all over it, covered in stains, and his hair and beard were shaggy and oily. "You wouldn't happen to be able to help me with something real quick, would you?" he asked. Having nothing to do, I said sure and stood up, but he quickly added, "Thanks, but I'm just asking for now. Still got some things to do first. I'll come back in a little bit and get you when I need a hand." I said, "Okay," and he thanked me again before walking away. It was a little odd that he came by if he didn't need me yet, but I figured he must have had to unpack his car first and would be back in 10 or 15 minutes. I waited, but a half hour passed, then another. The sun started going down, and I figured he must have taken care of it himself. 2 hours later, I had completely forgotten about it. I had the fire pit going and was making dinner when I heard footsteps again. I turned, but this time it was nearly pitch dark. I could hear the crunching of gravel, but whoever it was remained covered in darkness. I listened as the footsteps slowly entered the light of my fire. It was the same man, just as I thought. But why was he coming back now? "Hey, you ready? Still need a little help." With what?" I asked. He noticed my hesitation. "It'll only take a minute. You're not busy by the looks of it." He smiled, but it felt forced, like he was trying too hard to be casual. He also avoided my question. My social awkwardness failed me here. I nervously agreed, knowing I really had nothing else to do, and that it was obvious. He smiled again and started leading the way. As we got farther from my fire, it got much darker, and I realized how strange it was that he had walked here without a flashlight. It also felt wrong following him into the dark. "Hey, so what was it you needed my help with?" I asked. He slowed down for a moment, like he was about to say something, but then kept walking silently. He didn't answer. My heart rate spiked. My body knew something was wrong. Suddenly, the silence of the forest around me felt eerily calm, like the stillness before a storm. I started slowing down, trying to put some distance between us without making it obvious. I only got a few feet away before he turned around and looked at me. His fake smile immediately faded into a frown. He stopped walking, and so did I. Before I could say anything, I saw his hand move down into his jacket. I turned and bolted into the woods. Just as I did, I caught a glimpse of the handle of what I could only assume was a knife. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me, his heavy breathing as he chased me through the dark. I ran for at least 2 minutes before the sound of his footsteps slowed, then stopped. I kept running. Luckily, I had my phone and keys on me, so I called 911. When they arrived at the campsite, only my truck was there. The red car was gone, and so was the man. I described everything, the distinct look of both him and his car, but it wasn't enough. It's clear what was about to happen that night. What scares me the most is how he waited until it was dark and how he came by earlier to make me more likely to trust him later. It was terrifyingly manipulative. I worry that others may fall victim to him, or maybe already have.